Rain always sounded different when you were alone. On this particular evening, Lynn crouched on the back steps of her family's stately home, knees drawn to her chest, shivering in thin pajamas. The sharp scent of rain mixed with the metallic tinge of her own blood. She had nicked her hand on a jagged edge of glass. But Lynn barely noticed the sting. Her mind was elsewhere, running back over every detail, every accusation that had just been hurled at her in the living room. "Look at what you've done, you clumsy girl," Mrs. Chang's voice echoed in Lynn's memory. "This window was imported from Murano. Do you have any idea what that means?" Lynn had tried to explain. She'd only been trying to shut the heavy old window in the hallway, just as her stepmother had told her. But the latch slipped, the wind howled, and the beautiful glass shattered. Instantly, Mrs. Chang and her half-brother Brandon had appeared, expressions twisted in delight and outrage. Her father, as always, was nowhere to be found. Now, Lynn's punishment? A night locked outside. To think about what you've cost this family. She'd heard the door lock click, heard her stepmother's voice dripping with satisfaction as she told Brandon, "Let her learn some respect." Lynn pressed her palms tighter to her knees, feeling the cold seep into her bones. She tried not to cry. She was 16, old enough to know tears change nothing here. Thunder rumbled across the sky. From where she sat, Lynn could see into the bright, warm kitchen. Mrs. Chang making tea, laughing as she recounted the evening's events to Brandon. Lynn's father, Dr. William Chang, wasn't there. He was probably in his study, or at the hospital, always somewhere else, always just out of reach. As the clock ticked past midnight, Lynn's eyes drifted up toward her father's study window. The faintest glow seeped through the heavy curtains. Suddenly, a shadow moved behind the glass. Lynn frowned. Her father almost never came home before midnight, and if he did, he went straight to bed. Tonight was different. She watched as the study light flickered, then steadied. The silhouette of her father passed by once, then a second time. Then something strange. Another, unfamiliar figure appeared in the room. The two shadows seemed to argue. Lynn caught snatches of voices, just barely audible over the rain. The stranger's tone was rough, urgent. Her father's replies were tense, his posture rigid. A name was spoken. Lynn couldn't make it out. But then the stranger slammed a folder onto the desk. Lynn's pulse quickened. She had never seen anyone come to the house this late. Even more suspicious, her father's study had always been strictly off-limits. She moved quietly around the edge of the patio, slipping behind the rose trellis, her bare feet sinking into mud. Carefully, she edged beneath the study window, straining to hear. "You promised me, William," the stranger hissed. "You said she would never find out." "She won't," her father replied, voice cold. "Not if you keep your end. You're out of time. If she gets any part of that will, your wife's little plan falls apart. I'm not risking my name for your family's secrets." There was a pause. Lynn's heart hammered. Her father spoke, voice sharp. "You'll get your money. Just give me 1 more month." The stranger let out a grunt, and then silence. Lynn heard papers rustle, the creak of a chair. Then the study door opened and closed softly. For a long moment, Lynn stayed frozen in place, rain drenching her hair and soaking through her pajamas. Something cold and electric curled in her stomach. She didn't know what was in the will. She didn't know who the stranger was. But the fear in her father's voice, the panic in the stranger's. Lynn knew without a doubt that something enormous was being hidden from her. something that involved her, whether her family wanted her to know or not. Suddenly, the back porch light flicked on. Lin darted back to the steps, feigning sleepiness, wiping muddy streaks from her face. Mrs. Chang appeared, frowning in disgust at Lin's shivering form. "Still out here? I suppose that's enough punishment. Get in before you catch pneumonia, and scrub those floors before you go to bed. You reek of the outdoors." Lin stumbled to her feet and shuffled inside. The warmth of the kitchen was a shock to her system, but she barely noticed. Her mind replayed the words she'd overheard. "That will. Your wife's plan. Your family's secrets." She passed Brandon in the hallway. He sneered, sticking out a foot to trip her. "Next time, maybe try not being so useless, little orphan," he whispered, voice low and ugly. Lin ignored him, moving quickly to the storage closet where she kept her cleaning supplies. As she scrubbed the kitchen floor, Lin's mind spun. She remembered bits and pieces of her childhood. A time before Mrs. Chang, before Brandon, when her grandmother used to sing her lullabies and show her the rainbow glass vases in the old sunroom. Her grandmother had loved art, especially glasswork, and she taught Lin how to see the world through color and light. But ever since her grandmother passed away, everything had changed. Her father withdrew into work. Mrs. Chang took over the house, and Lin was reduced to a shadow in her own family. She looked at her bandaged palm, the blood seeping through gauze, and felt a flicker of something hot and determined beneath the exhaustion. Maybe the broken window was a sign, a fracture in the perfect facade her family tried so hard to maintain. Maybe it was time to start asking questions. That night, after everyone else had gone to sleep, Lin crept quietly into the hallway and stood before her grandmother's old sunroom. The door was locked, as always, but she pressed her hand to the glass and whispered, "Help me, Grandma. Please. I need to know what's really going on." Outside, thunder rolled again, and somewhere deep in the house, Lin thought she heard the softest tinkle of glass, like a signal or a promise. She didn't know what secrets her family was hiding, but she knew she was done being invisible. Whatever they were protecting, whatever the truth was, Lin would find it. And this time, no one would lock her out. The next morning, Lin awoke before dawn, her entire body aching from the cold and the weight of humiliation. The night's events replayed in her mind as she slowly peeled herself out of bed. A simple cot shoved into the corner of a laundry room, surrounded by detergent boxes and mop buckets. There were no family photos on her wall, no soft toys from childhood. Here she existed in the margins. The big house was always eerily quiet at this hour, except for the low hum of the central heating and the occasional creak of aging wood. Lin tiptoed through the back hallway, careful not to wake anyone. She stopped by the bathroom, washed her face and stared at her reflection. Her eyes looked tired, older than her 16 years. There were faint shadows beneath her cheekbones and a splotch of dried blood beneath the bandage on her hand. She pressed her lips together, straightened her shoulders, and forced herself to look away. Breakfast was a strictly choreographed performance in the Chang household. By 6:30 a.m., Mrs. Chang expected the table to be set, coffee brewing, eggs cooked to perfection, and Brandon's favorite pancakes stacked high. Lin worked in silence, moving quickly and efficiently. She'd learned early on that making herself invisible was safer. Draw no attention, make no noise, finish everything before anyone had reason to complain. By the time Mrs. Chang swept into the kitchen in her silk robe, Lin had already cleared away the mess from last night and laid out fresh place settings. "About time," Mrs. Chang sniffed, glancing at Lynn's bruised hands. "Hurry up, or Brandon will be late for school. He has basketball practice before class." "Yes, ma'am," Lynn replied quietly. Brandon sauntered in, his hair still wet from the shower, headphones hanging around his neck. He ignored Lynn completely, scrolling through his phone while Mrs. Chang poured him orange juice and fussed over his tie. "Your college advisor called, darling?" Mrs. Chang said sweetly. "She thinks you have a real shot at Princeton if you keep your grades up." Brandon grinned. "Told you, Mom. Piece of cake." They laughed together, oblivious to Lynn as she scrubbed a stubborn stain on the countertop. She'd heard the conversation 100 times before, about scholarships, internships, family legacies. Her father's name opened doors for Brandon. Mrs. Chang's social connections sealed the deal. At 7:15 sharp, Dr. Chang emerged from his study, already dressed in a crisp suit. He barely glanced at Lynn as he accepted a mug of coffee from her hands. "Thank you, Lily," he mumbled absently, using the wrong name as always. Lynn said nothing, lowering her gaze. Mrs. Chang ushered her husband and son out the door, waving and kissing them both on the cheek. Then, in the hush that followed, she turned to Lynn, her face sharpening. "You'll deep clean the downstairs bathroom today. And don't forget the attic. There's dust everywhere. I want this house spotless before I get back from yoga." "Yes, ma'am," Lynn replied. It was always yes, ma'am, never any other answer. As the door slammed shut behind her stepmother, Lynn exhaled. For a few precious hours, the house was hers, if only to clean and labor in peace. She moved through her chores quickly, methodically. As she dusted the picture frames in the hallway, she paused before a row of family portraits. Dr. Chang, Mrs. Chang, and Brandon, smiling on vacation, standing on the steps of Ivy League universities, posing with awards and trophies. Lynn was nowhere to be found. Not a single photo included her, not since she was 10 years old. Back then, her mother was still alive, and the house had felt like home. The pain stabbed at her chest, sharp and sudden. She pushed it down. She always did. When the cleaning was finished, Lynn grabbed her backpack and left through the back door. She biked the mile to school, keeping her head down as she passed neighbors who never bothered to remember her name. At school, Lynn faded easily into the background. She didn't have friends. Brandon and his crowd made sure of that. They called her the maid behind her back, sneered at her thrift store shoes, and the sack lunches she brought from home. Between classes, Lynn sought refuge in the art room. Here, surrounded by the smell of paint, chalk dust, and old clay, she could breathe. Mr. Wheeler, the art teacher, nodded to her as she entered. "Hey, Lynn. You're here early again," he said, not unkindly. She nodded, setting her backpack down. I wanted to finish the glasswork for the spring showcase." Mr. Wheeler smiled, his eyes kind behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Take all the time you need. You're one of the most talented students I've had, you know that?" Lynn flushed, ducking her head. Compliments always felt like traps at home. But here, they were gentle, genuine. She moved to her favorite workstation, where her glass-blowing project, a delicate blue and gold vase, waited on the shelf. Glass was her escape. With every piece she shaped, she felt a sliver of herself return, vibrant and alive. Carefully, she heated the glass, twisting it into the beginnings of a spiral. The process required patience, a steady hand, and an artist's eye. Skills Lynn had honed in secret, inspired by distant memories of her grandmother's laughter and stories about Murano glass. "Do you ever think about entering the state competition?" Mr. Wheeler asked, watching her work. "You have real potential, Lynn. The winner gets a scholarship. It could change everything." She hesitated. She knew Mrs. Chang would never allow it. The arts were a waste of time in her eyes. Still, the idea took root, glowing softly like a coal in the dark. "Maybe," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The bell rang, and Lynn packed up her things, already dreading the gauntlet of the hallways. As she slipped out, Brandon brushed past her, sneering. "Careful, Cinderella. Wouldn't want you to get glass in your shoes," he murmured, loud enough for his friends to snicker. Lynn ignored him, holding her head high as she disappeared into the crowd. The rest of the day passed in a blur of lectures and assignments. At lunch, Lynn sat alone beneath a tree outside, reading a library book on famous glass artists. She wondered what it would feel like to be recognized for her talent, to be seen, not as the maid, not as the invisible daughter, but as someone who mattered. When school ended, she lingered in the art room until the last bell. Mr. Wheeler handed her a brochure for the upcoming state glasswork competition, his expression encouraging. "Just think about it, Lynn. You deserve a chance," she nodded, tucking the brochure into her backpack. As she pedaled home, wind stinging her cheeks, a thought struck her. Maybe she didn't have to stay invisible forever. Maybe somehow she could make them see her. Not for their sake, but for her own. Back at the house, Mrs. Chang returned from yoga, scrutinizing Lynn's work with a sharp eye. She found a smudge on a window and berated Lynn for her carelessness, then reminded her to cook dinner. Lynn complied, moving through the motions of her evening routine. But as the sun set and the house fell silent, she retrieved the competition brochure, smoothing the creased paper between her fingers. For the first time in a long while, hope glimmered faintly in Lynn's chest. Tomorrow, she promised herself. Tomorrow, she would find a way to enter that competition. Tomorrow, she would start searching for answers. About the will, about her grandmother, about her place in this family. And maybe, just maybe, she would learn how to be seen. Thursday mornings were always the hardest for Lynn. Brandon had early basketball practice, which meant he left his dirty uniform in the laundry and trailed muddy sneakers through the hall. Mrs. Chang fussed even more than usual, convinced that every speck of dust was Lynn's fault. And Dr. Chang seemed increasingly distant, his rare moments at home marked by silence and curt replies. By sunrise, Lynn was already up, carefully scrubbing Brandon's uniform in the laundry room sink. She listened to the radio quietly, finding comfort in the distant voices and music. Sometimes as she worked, she would imagine being far away, a tiny apartment filled with her own glasswork. No one's voice raised in anger, nobody making her feel small. The daydream never lasted long. Mrs. Chang appeared in the doorway, phone glued to her ear, eyes narrowed. "Don't forget to iron his shirt this time, Lynn," she snapped, not bothering to cover the phone. "And make sure there's no breakfast mess in the dining room." "Yes, ma'am," Lynn answered. She watched her stepmother glide away, laughter already returning as she resumed her conversation. Lynn felt her jaw clench. She used to crave Mrs. Chang's approval, but lately, the constant criticism just washed over her like cold rain. When the house finally emptied, Lynn changed into jeans and a faded hoodie, grabbed her backpack, and biked to school. The air was sharp, the trees bare and skeletal, a reminder that winter was not yet ready to give up its hold on New Jersey. School was the only place Lynn could breathe. But even here, she walked the edges. Her classmates barely noticed her, except when they needed someone to copy homework or clean up the art room. Brandon's friends ignored her, except for the occasional sneer. The only safe place was the art room. She arrived early as usual. Mr. Wheeler was prepping supplies for his advanced glasswork class. He looked up and offered Lynn a genuine smile. "Morning, Lynn. Did you think about the competition?" he asked, gesturing to the brochure still tucked in her bag. She nodded, tentative. "I want to enter, but I'm not sure my family will let me." Mr. Wheeler leaned in, voice low and reassuring. "Let me talk to the principal. We can handle the paperwork and fees. All you have to do is make your best piece." He paused, noticing the faded bruises on her wrist. "Are you all right, Lynn?" She forced a smile. "I'm fine. Just clumsy, that's all." He didn't push, but she saw the worry in his eyes. They worked together in companionable silence, Lynn focusing on her glass sculpture. She chose cobalt blue and flecks of gold, colors that reminded her of her grandmother's favorite vase. Each piece of glass she cut and fused became a silent rebellion, a tiny act of claiming something for herself. Later that morning, as she was packing up her tools, a girl named Melanie approached her workstation. Melanie was popular, smart, and always seemed to move through life with effortless confidence. "Hey, Lynn," she said, glancing at Lynn's project. "That's really pretty. Did you make that?" Lynn nodded, uncertain. "It's not finished yet." Melanie grinned. "I couldn't do that in a million years. You know, the art department is always looking for helpers for the spring showcase. You should sign up." Lynn blinked, surprised by the kindness. "Maybe I will. Thanks, Melanie." For a moment, Lynn let herself believe that things could be different, but hope was a fragile thing in her world. After third period, Brandon cornered her by the lockers. His voice was low, cruel. "Stay out of the way at school, okay? Mom doesn't want you drawing attention to yourself." She glared at him, something new sparking in her chest. "Why do you care what I do?" He leaned in, his breath hot and sour. "Because you're not really part of this family. The sooner you get that, the better." The word stung, but Lynn held his gaze. "We share the same father," she said, voice shaking, but steady. Brandon laughed. "That's just biology. You're nothing like us." Lynn bit back a retort, refusing to let him see her cry. She turned and walked away, head high. For the rest of the day, she barely spoke. The weight of Brandon's words followed her like a shadow. After school, Lynn returned to the art room, determined to lose herself in her work. Mr. Wheeler had set up a special project, an intricate stained glass piece for the spring showcase. He invited Lynn to help. As she cut and arranged pieces of colored glass, Mr. Wheeler spoke quietly. "You know, art can be a way of telling your story, Lynn, even when words aren't safe." She nodded, hands steady despite her racing heart. She thought of her grandmother's sunroom, the way light danced through every window, painting the walls in colors nobody else seemed to notice. Maybe she could make something that would force her family, her entire world, to finally see her. On her way home, Lynn made a detour past the town library, searching for books about glasswork and family law. She found a thin volume on inheritance and wills, and another about the history of stained glass. As she flipped through the pages, she remembered the strange conversation she'd overheard between her father and the stranger, the mention of a will and secrets hidden from her. A wild idea began to take shape. Maybe, just maybe, the truth about her family and herself was hidden in something as fragile as glass. That night, after finishing her chores, Lynn waited until the house was silent. She crept into her grandmother's locked sunroom, using the tiny screwdriver she'd swiped from her father's toolbox. The old lock gave way with a soft click. Inside, the air was thick with dust and memory. Colored glass vases lined the windowsills, catching the faint glow from the moon outside. Lynn moved carefully, searching through drawers and boxes. In a battered tin beneath her grandmother's sewing table, she found a stack of letters tied with ribbon. Most were from her grandmother. Gentle words, encouragement, stories of family pride. But tucked among them was a folded yellow document, the first page of a will, written in her grandmother's neat, looping script. Lynn's heart pounded as she read the opening lines. "To my beloved granddaughter, Lynn." The rest of the page was missing, torn away. Suddenly, the hallway light snapped on. Lynn froze. Mrs. Chang's voice cut through the darkness. "What do you think you're doing in here?" Lynn swallowed, hiding the letter behind her back. I was just cleaning." Mrs. Chang's eyes narrowed. "You're lying. That room is off limits. If I catch you in here again, you'll regret it." Lynn fled, heart racing, clutching the fragment of the will. Back in the laundry room, she unwrapped the ribbon and read her grandmother's words again and again. For the first time in years, Lynn felt the first fissure of hope. The truth was out there, fragile, but real, waiting for her to claim it. And as she drifted off to sleep, she vowed, whatever it cost, she would find the rest of the will, no matter what it meant for her fractured family. The morning after sneaking into the sunroom, Lynn awoke before sunrise, clutching the torn fragment of her grandmother's will beneath her pillow. She barely slept, mind swirling with questions. Who tore out the rest of the will? Why was her grandmother's bequest to her hidden? What did the rest of the family know? But Lynn's thoughts were quickly interrupted by the shrill ring of Mrs. Chang's voice. "Ling downstairs now!" She hurried to the kitchen, heart pounding. Mrs. Chang stood at the counter, hands folded neatly, lips pursed. Brandon sat at the breakfast bar, an eager smirk on his face. "Come here," Mrs. Chang said, her voice icy. Lynn braced herself. Mrs. Chang slid a velvet-lined jewelry box across the counter. Inside, nestled on blue silk, was a heavy gold necklace. Her stepmother's favorite, a family heirloom. "Do you know what this is?" Lynn nodded. She'd seen it often, at holidays, at family parties, worn as a badge of status. "It's missing," Mrs. Chang announced, eyes boring into Lynn. "Last night, after you finished cleaning, it was here. This morning, it's gone." A chill spread through Lynn's chest. I didn't touch it. I never—" Brandon cut her off with a theatrical sigh. "Mom, she's the only one who goes in your room. Who else would take it?" Lynn looked desperately at her father, but Dr. Chang barely glanced up from his tablet. "Where is it, Lynn?" he asked quietly, as if already resigned. "I swear I didn't—" Mrs. Chang slammed the box shut. "You will not lie in my house until you return what you stole. You are grounded. No school events, no art club, no phone, and no allowance. Do you understand?" Lynn's mouth went dry. The art competition, the only hope she dared to nurture, was suddenly slipping away. "But the showcase? No exceptions." Mrs. Chang's eyes flashed. "Maybe a week of hard work will remind you of your place here." Brandon grinned, and Lynn realized with a sick jolt that he was enjoying every second of her misery. This wasn't about a necklace. It was about control, about punishing Lynn for daring to exist, for daring to be more than invisible. She fled to the laundry room, tears burning behind her eyes. She knew she hadn't taken the necklace. She also knew from years of experience that logic and protest would get her nowhere. In this house, truth was whatever Mrs. Chang decided it would be. But as she wiped her eyes, Lynn caught sight of her backpack. the art competition brochure poking out from between her textbooks. She couldn't give up, not after finding the will, not after seeing the fear in her father's eyes last night. She had to find a way out. The school day passed in a blur. Without her phone, Lynn had to borrow supplies from the library. She snuck into the art room after class, hoping Mr. Wheeler might help. He was there, prepping for the spring showcase. "You look rough," he said gently. "Everything okay at home?" Lynn shook her head. "My stepmother, she said I stole something. I didn't, but now I can't enter the competition." Mr. Wheeler frowned, concern deepening. "That's not fair, Lynn. You have talent. If you need help, I'll figure it out," Lynn whispered. She was tired of asking for help, tired of hope being dangled and then snatched away. That afternoon, after finishing her chores, Lynn searched her stepmother's room, careful, methodical, leaving everything as she found it. She checked drawers, jewelry boxes, under the bed. Nothing, but as she closed the closet door, she heard voices drifting up from the entryway. "If she doesn't learn her lesson now, she never will," Mrs. Chang was saying. "Sometimes you have to be cruel to be kind." "I just want peace in this house, Margaret," Dr. Chang replied, his voice weary. "After the way she broke the window." Lynn pressed closer to the door, anger and hurt rising in her chest. They weren't even talking about the necklace anymore. This was about power, about keeping her small. She left the room before she was caught, returning to her own cramped corner. There, she pulled out her grandmother's letters, hoping to find comfort. Among them was a note she hadn't noticed before, a small handwritten scrap. "If you ever feel alone, remember, light passes through even the thickest glass. Look for the sun at noon." It was cryptic, but it felt like a message meant for her. That night, unable to sleep, Lynn replayed the events of the past few days. The will, the missing necklace, the strange late-night visitor. She saw the connections forming, a web spun to keep her silent, unseen, erased. She needed help, but who could she trust? Certainly not her family. The next morning, while Brandon was at practice and Mrs. Chang out for her Pilates class, Lynn slipped outside and made her way to the sunroom. At noon, as her grandmother's note suggested, she watched the sunlight beam through the stained glass windows. The shifting colors formed patterns on the floor, illuminating a section of the old bookshelf. With shaking hands, Lynn moved the books aside. There, taped to the back panel, she found a slim, velvet pouch. The missing gold necklace. Her breath caught. She hadn't taken it. She hadn't even known where to look. But someone wanted her to find it here. Hidden, but not lost forever. Suddenly, the front door slammed. Lynn panicked, hiding the pouch in her pocket. She raced back to the kitchen, heart pounding. When Mrs. Chang returned, Lynn waited for her chance. At dinner, as the family gathered in their usual stiff silence, Lynn cleared her throat. "I found your necklace, Mrs. Chang. It was in the sunroom, behind the bookshelf." Mrs. Chang's eyes widened. Just a fraction. Brandon shot her a warning look, but Lynn pressed on. "I guess it must have fallen there. I'm sorry for the trouble." For a moment, nobody spoke. Dr. Chang looked between his wife and daughter, confusion flickering across his face. "Well, how careless of you, Margaret," he muttered, trying to lighten the mood. "Good thing Lynn is so thorough." Mrs. Chang's mouth twisted, but she managed a brittle smile. "Thank you, Lynn. I suppose you may return to your school activities. But remember, mistakes have consequences." Lynn bowed her head, hiding her trembling hands. She knew this wasn't over. Her stepmother's scheme had failed, but only for now. That night, Lynn placed the will fragment and her grandmother's note side by side, studying them beneath the weak lamp. Her stepmother had tried to break her spirit. Instead, Lynn felt something inside her solidify. A quiet, steely resolve. If her family wanted a war, she would give them one. And she would fight with the only weapon she had. Truth, light, and the unbreakable artistry of her own hands. Spring arrived quietly in the suburbs of New Jersey, sneaking up on Lynn in small golden slants of sunlight and the soft scent of hyacinths outside the laundry room window. Life inside the Chang household, however, remained as cold and calculated as ever. Lynn spent her days moving like a shadow through the house, keeping to herself, clinging to the shreds of hope offered by her grandmother's letters and the upcoming art competition. One Saturday, as Lynn was mopping the kitchen, Mrs. Chang's voice cut through her concentration like a razor. "After you're done, clean out the basement. The realtor is coming to appraise the house. We can't have her seeing all that junk." Lynn nodded silently, dread twisting in her stomach. The basement was a maze of old boxes, broken furniture, and relics from a happier past. It was also the one part of the house she'd never fully explored. Her stepmother rarely let her down there, and the memories were thick as dust. With a heavy sigh, Lynn descended the rickety wooden steps, her flashlight beam slicing through the gloom. Cobwebs brushed her cheeks. Shadows loomed large against crumbling concrete walls. She moved slowly, methodically, shifting stacks of boxes labeled in her grandmother's delicate handwriting. Christmas ornaments, family albums, glass fragile. Lynn paused, drawn to the last box. She gingerly opened the lid, revealing layers of tissue paper wrapped around what looked like shards of colored glass. At the bottom of the box, beneath the glass fragments, was a faded leather-bound book. Lynn opened it carefully, expecting recipes or family notes, but instead, she found an envelope, yellowed with age, sealed with wax. Her breath caught. Written across the front, in her grandmother's looping script, were the words, "For Lynn, open when you are ready." Hands trembling, Lynn broke the seal. Inside were several folded documents, a letter and a copy of an official will, stamped and notarized. The letter began, "My dearest Lynn, if you are reading this, it means you have already seen what kind of people run this house. Do not be afraid. You are stronger than they will ever know, and you have a right to everything your mother and I built. This will is my final act of love for you. I leave you, and only you, my personal collection of glasswork, the sunroom, and a share of the family estate. No one can take this from you, not legally. If anyone hides or destroys this document, they are breaking the law. But most importantly, never let them tell you that you are less. You are my granddaughter, my light, my glass daughter. With love, Grandma." Lynn's hand shook as she unfolded the will. There it was, clear as day. Her name, written in ink, entitled to assets that had been locked away, ignored, or worse, deliberately hidden by those who claimed to love her. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked above her head. Lynn's heart leapt into her throat. She quickly tucked the documents into her hoodie and shut the box. Footsteps sounded on the basement stairs. It was Brandon. He squinted into the darkness, his voice harsh. "Mom says to hurry up. She wants the basement spotless before dinner." "What's taking you so long?" "Just finishing up," Lynn replied, struggling to keep her tone even. Brandon's gaze flicked to the glass shards. "Didn't she tell you not to mess with that stuff? You're always so slow. No wonder nobody wants you here." Lynn ignored him, her mind racing. She needed to hide the documents somewhere safe. After Brandon left, she finished her chores quickly, then hurried to the sunroom. Locking the door behind her, she pulled out the letter and will, smoothing them on the old sewing table under a beam of afternoon light. For the first time in weeks, Lynn allowed herself a small trembling smile. She felt her grandmother's presence, gentle, proud, and protective. But relief quickly turned to determination. This was her proof, her shield. Now she needed to understand what it meant and what she could do. She took pictures of the documents with the old disposable camera she kept hidden, just in case. Then she tucked the originals behind a loose floorboard beneath her cot in the laundry room. The next step was to find help. Someone who could tell her how to make the will legally binding, or at least keep it from disappearing. But who could she trust? Her first thought was Mr. Wheeler, her art teacher. He'd always been kind, and he'd told her more than once that art could change a life. The next day at school, Lynn waited until the end of class before approaching him. "Mr. Wheeler, do you know anyone who could help with legal documents?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. He frowned, concern flickering in his eyes. "Is everything okay, Lynn?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Just hypothetically, like if someone found an old will or something." Mr. Wheeler's gaze sharpened. "I know a lawyer in town. She volunteers for students in tough situations. I can get you her number." "Is this about your family?" Lynn forced a shaky smile. "Sort of. Thank you, Mr. Wheeler." She slipped the number into her pocket, her heart pounding. It felt dangerous, but also exhilarating. For the first time, Lynn felt like she had agency, like she was pushing back against the weight of silence and secrets that had held her captive for so long. But Lynn wasn't the only one watching. That evening, as she prepared dinner, Mrs. Chang entered the kitchen, her face cold and calculating. "You've been awfully quiet lately. Don't get any ideas. You owe everything you have to this family, Lynn. You'd be nothing without us." Lynn met her stepmother's gaze for the first time in years, eyes steady. "That's not true," she said softly. "You're wrong about me." Mrs. Chang blinked, startled. For a moment, Lynn thought she saw fear flicker in her stepmother's eyes. It was gone in an instant, replaced by icy contempt. "Watch your tone," Mrs. Chang snapped. "You may have found that necklace, but one more mistake. One, and you'll wish you hadn't." Lynn turned away, not trusting herself to speak. She felt the weight of her grandmother's words settling in her chest, like armor. She had proof now. She had something to fight for. That night, under the thin blanket in the laundry room, Lynn whispered a promise to herself. She would see this through, no matter what it cost. She would claim her birthright, not out of hate, but out of justice. She would not let her grandmother's legacy die in the dark. And as sleep finally overtook her, Lynn dreamed of sunlight spilling through stained glass, painting the future in shards of hope and color. The world outside was waking up, sunlight glinting off rows of tidy hedges, the distant sound of a lawnmower, and somewhere, a dog barking. But inside the Chang house, it was as if time had stopped. Lynn stared at the number Mr. Wheeler had given her, the digits pressed into her palm like a lifeline. She wanted to call the lawyer, to take the next step, but fear held her back. What if it made everything worse? What if they found out? Still, something in her had shifted. Each time Mrs. Chang snapped an order, or Brandon sneered, Lynn no longer felt only shame or powerlessness. There was anger now, and beneath it, a dangerous kind of hope. The hidden will changed everything. but it also made everything more precarious. The following week, Lynn waited until the house was empty. She dialed the lawyer's number from the payphone at the corner store. The woman's voice was calm and confident. "Miss Tran, you said I'll meet you tomorrow after school. Bring the documents. Don't tell anyone." All day, Lynn's nerves were electric. At last, the final bell rang, and she hurried to the public library. Miss Rivera, the lawyer, was waiting at a small table near the window. She was young, with a kind face and sharp eyes that seemed to see through everything. Lynn slid the photos of the will and letter across the table, her hands trembling. "My stepmother. She's been hiding this. I think they tore up the original after my grandmother died." Miss Rivera read carefully, then looked up. "This is real. Your grandmother left you her collection, the sunroom, and a share of the estate. If the will was hidden, it's fraud. If anyone forged a newer document, that's a crime. Do you have any idea where the original might be?" Lynn shook her head. "Just this copy. I think my stepmother or my dad might know." Miss Rivera nodded, expression serious. "Keep these photos safe. I'll look into the probate records and see if a newer will was filed. In the meantime, don't let them know you're onto them. Not yet." Lynn left the meeting feeling a little lighter, but also more exposed. She was stepping onto a battlefield she'd never wanted, armed with nothing but her own resolve and a stack of fragile paper. That evening, as Lynn set the table for dinner, she overheard her parents arguing in the next room. "I told you, William, she's getting too curious," Mrs. Chang hissed. "If she finds the rest of the documents—" "She won't," Dr. Chang snapped, sounding tired. "She's just a child. Besides, what are you so worried about? The estate is locked up. No judge will hand it over to a girl who's done nothing but cause trouble." Mrs. Chang's voice grew icy. "If she goes to a lawyer, it won't matter what you think. You promised me when we married. This house, the inheritance, the reputation. You think I didn't notice the way your mother always looked at her? Like Lynn was the precious one, not Brandon." There was a tense silence. Dr. Chang's voice dropped to a whisper. "Margaret, you know why we did what we did. The family expected me to remarry, to have a son. Your son is the face of this family now, but if Lynn gets any piece of that estate..." Mrs. Chang cut him off. "That little orphan is not taking 1 cent from us. I will destroy every shred of evidence if I have to. You'd better keep her in line." Lynn's stomach turned to ice. She pressed her back to the wall, every word a fresh blade. So it was true. Her own father, her flesh and blood, had stood by while her stepmother plotted to erase her, to steal her future. Worse, he'd helped her do it. She barely made it through dinner, face blank, hands trembling. Mrs. Chang watched her with a calculating smile, as if daring her to fight back. Brandon didn't even notice. He was too busy scrolling on his phone. That night, as Lynn lay awake on her narrow cot, she replayed the conversation again and again. The betrayal felt almost physical, as if something inside her had cracked for good. She pressed her hand to her chest, willing herself not to cry. But with the pain came clarity. They wanted her to be silent. They wanted her to give up. Instead, Lynn began to plan. The next day, she returned to the sunroom after school. Alone in the filtered rainbow light, she let herself grieve for the family she wished she'd had, and for the girl she'd been before this revelation. She reread her grandmother's letters, drawing strength from every loving word. Then she found something she hadn't noticed before. Tucked inside the book of family stories, pressed between 2 pages, was a faded photograph. On the back, in her grandmother's script. The day Lin came home, my greatest joy. The picture showed Lin at 5 years old, arms full of glass marbles, beaming up at her grandmother. Her father was there too, standing off to the side, distant even then. Suddenly, Lin understood. The sunroom, the glass collection, the care her grandmother had lavished on her. It was all for Lin, all along. She was meant to inherit not just things, but a sense of belonging. A strange calm settled over her. For the first time, Lin allowed herself to imagine what revenge could really mean. Not petty payback, but justice. The truth revealed. Her dignity restored. Armed with her grandmother's legacy, Lin started preparing her entry for the art competition. She poured everything she felt, betrayal, hope, pain, and pride, into the molten glass, shaping it into something radiant and unbreakable. Meanwhile, she began gathering evidence. She took photographs of every letter, every hiding place. She kept a journal of everything she overheard. She watched, waited, and learned. Quiet, invisible, but not defeated. One afternoon, Brandon barged into the art room at school, finding her working late. He glanced at her sculpture, a swirling blue and gold vase, alive with color and light. "What is that supposed to be?" he scoffed. "It's about strength," Lin answered quietly. "The kind you find when nobody stands up for you." Brandon rolled his eyes, but for once he looked unsettled. Maybe he sensed the change in her. At home, Mrs. Chang's suspicion grew. She questioned Lin about every phone call, every after-school activity. Dr. Chang grew more withdrawn, his eyes haunted and guilty. The walls of the Chang family were beginning to crack, and Lin, once silent, once invisible, was the one wielding the hammer. That night, before bed, Lin whispered a promise to her grandmother's memory. "They will not win. I will show them what real family means, and I will do it on my own terms." As the moonlight spilled across the sunroom's stained glass, Lin felt the first glimmer of true freedom. A sense that the story of her life was finally hers to write. The days that followed unfolded like the hush before a thunderstorm. Quiet on the surface, but electric underneath. Lin went about her chores as usual, her movements careful and measured. But inside her mind raced with strategy. She understood now. This was not simply about surviving. It was about reclaiming what was hers, her legacy, her dignity, her future. With Ms. Rivera's guidance, Lin began to document everything. She slipped quietly through the house, photographing old family records, snapping pictures of the sunroom's art, and making copies of every note and letter her grandmother had left behind. Miss Rivera met with her twice more at the library, explaining the slow, careful process of building a case. "You're strong, Lin," Miss Rivera told her, voice low and steady. "But you need to be patient. The law can be slow, and your stepmother will fight back. But truth is on your side." Lin nodded, soaking in the encouragement. She clung to every kind word like a lifeline. Meanwhile, she threw herself into her art with a new urgency. The competition deadline was only weeks away, and she wanted her entry to be more than just a sculpture. It needed to be a statement, a declaration that she existed, that she could not be erased. Late at night, after the house fell silent, she sketched new designs by flashlight, remembering her grandmother's lessons about light, color, and resilience. The new piece she envisioned was ambitious. A tall, slender vase, its surface swirling with molten gold and sapphire, etched with hidden patterns only visible in sunlight. She named it Unbreakable. At school, Mr. Wheeler noticed the change in her. "You're working harder than ever, Lynn. Everything all right at home?" She hesitated, then nodded. "I just need to prove something. To myself and to everyone else." He smiled, pride clear in his eyes. "Art can be a way out, you know. Sometimes it's all you need to show people who you really are." But not everyone was rooting for her. Brandon had grown more unpredictable, sometimes sneering, sometimes distant. One afternoon, she found him rifling through her backpack after practice, searching for something. "What are you doing?" Lynn demanded, voice sharper than she intended. He shrugged, not meeting her eyes. "Mom thinks you're hiding something. She says you're up to something weird. Better watch yourself." Lynn's jaw clenched, but she refused to show fear. "You should stop listening to her, Brandon. She's not as clever as she thinks." He scowled, but she saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. For the first time, she wondered if Brandon, too, was just a pawn in Mrs. Chang's larger game. At home, Mrs. Chang's paranoia grew. She searched Lynn's room, double-checked her chores, and grilled her about her whereabouts. But Lynn was always careful. She kept the original documents hidden beneath a loose floorboard, carried copies with her at all times, and never left anything unattended. The storm broke one evening when Mrs. Chang discovered Lynn's competition entry forms, tucked beneath a stack of textbooks. She waved them in Lynn's face at dinner, voice shrill with rage. "You think you're going to enter this after all the trouble you've caused? I forbid it. No art, no competitions. You are grounded until further notice." Dr. Chang glanced up, face drawn, but said nothing. Lynn stood up, voice trembling but clear. "You can't stop me, Mrs. Chang. This is my future. My grandmother wanted me to have this." Mrs. Chang's lips curled in a bitter smile. "Your grandmother is gone, and you have nothing. You're lucky we let you stay in this house at all." For a moment, Lynn saw the truth behind the anger. Fear. Her stepmother was afraid because she was losing control. Lynn gathered her things and left the table, refusing to let her tears show. That night, she called Miss Rivera from a payphone in the rain. "She's trying to stop me from entering the competition," Lynn said, voice small and hoarse. "She's searching my things. I don't know what to do." Ms. Rivera's voice was steady. "You're almost 18, Lynn. You have rights. As long as you have your documents and you can get to the school, you can enter. I'll talk to the principal if needed. And if she tries anything illegal, you call me, no matter what." It was the first time anyone had ever told Lynn she had rights. The words rang in her ears like a battle cry. The next day at school, Lynn arrived early to the art room. Mr. Wheeler was already there, preparing supplies. When he saw the tears in her eyes, he said quietly, "You're not alone, Lynn. If you need somewhere to stay, or someone to talk to, just say the word." She almost broke down then, but instead she just nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Thank you," she whispered. The days rushed by. Lynn worked late into the evenings, perfecting her glasswork, writing down her grandmother's stories, and etching small messages into the vase. Phrases like, "You are seen," and "the light always returns." Each word was for herself, but also for anyone else who might feel invisible. On the night before the competition, Lynn double-checked her entry form, packed her sculpture carefully, and tucked the envelope with the will and letters deep in her backpack. She barely slept, heart pounding with both fear and anticipation. At dawn, as she slipped out to the back door, she heard Mrs. Chang's voice from the top of the stairs. "If you leave this house, don't bother coming back." Lynn paused, fingers tight on the doorknob. She turned and met her stepmother's eyes for the first time. Truly met them. Unafraid. "Maybe I won't," she said softly. Then, for the first time, Lynn stepped into the sunlight, not as a shadow, but as someone ready to fight for her place in the world. The storm had gathered. The time for hiding was over. The air in the high school's art wing was charged with nervous excitement. Lynn's glass sculpture, her unbreakable, was cradled carefully in her arms as she entered the contest room. Her fellow students milled about, displaying paintings, pottery, and dazzling glasswork under bright white lights. The spring showcase was the biggest event of the year. Teachers, parents, and even local press would attend. For Lynn, it was more than a competition. It was a declaration of existence. She set her sculpture on the display table, checking every detail, the swirling blues, the hidden golden phrases. As sunlight filtered through the windows, her piece glowed, a prism of light scattering across the floor. Mr. Wheeler approached, a proud smile on his face. "It's stunning, Lynn. I've never seen you put so much of yourself into a piece before." She blushed, trying not to show how much the praise meant. "Thank you, Mr. Wheeler. I just needed to." He nodded, understanding more than he said. "You'll want to be here early tomorrow for the final judging. Don't worry, I'll make sure everything's safe overnight." Lynn left the school feeling lighter than she had in months. But that feeling didn't last. As she biked home, her phone buzzed. A rare text from Brandon. "Come home. Mom's freaking out." She barely made it through the front door before Mrs. Chang pounced, brandishing an envelope. "You think you're clever, sneaking out like a thief? Don't ever embarrass me again. If you lose this competition, don't bother showing your face in this house." Dr. Chang hovered nearby, silent as always. Lynn felt nothing. No fear, no anger, just numbness. She went to her cot, closed her eyes, and willed herself to sleep. But sleep was impossible. At midnight, a crash echoed from downstairs. Lynn jolted upright. At first, she thought she'd dreamed it. Then, another sound, the faint tinkle of glass. Panic rose in her chest. She hurriedly pulled on her jacket and slipped out the window, hurrying back toward the school. Inside, the showcase room was dark. Her heart pounded as she used her phone's flashlight to scan the tables. There! Her sculpture, knocked over, shattered on the linoleum floor. The swirling colors, the golden letters, the weeks of work, ruined. Tiny shards sparkled in the light like tears. Lynn's knees buckled. She covered her mouth, desperate to keep from sobbing. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw a shadow move by the door, a figure ducking out into the hallway. She chased after it, stumbling on broken glass. In the hallway, Brandon waited, hands in his jacket pockets, face half hidden by the shadows. "Brandon!" she cried, voice raw. "Why would you do this?" He shrugged, eyes darting away. "You think you're so special. Mom said you'd embarrass us. She told me to make sure you didn't win." Lynn stared at him, the pain of betrayal cutting deeper than the destruction of her art. "You didn't have to listen. You could have said no." He flinched, guilt flashing in his eyes. "You don't know what it's like. Always being compared to you, even when you're not trying. You get the sympathy, I get the pressure." Lynn shook her head. "That's not my fault. You made your choice." She turned, tears streaming down her face, and fled back to the art room. She didn't know how long she sat there, staring at the wreckage of her dreams. Every piece of glass was a memory. Her grandmother's stories, the sunroom's kaleidoscope light, the promises she'd made to herself. All gone, For a moment, the urge to give up was overwhelming. What was the point? Her family had always found ways to break her. Why would this time be different? As dawn broke, Linh still sat amid the ruins, numb and exhausted. Then a hand rested gently on her shoulder. She looked up, startled. Mr. Wheeler knelt beside her, eyes filled with concern. "I saw the alarm notification," he said softly. "What happened?" Linh tried to speak, but only sobs came out. "Brandon, he destroyed it. Everything's gone. I can't compete now." Mr. Wheeler squeezed her shoulder. "No, Linh, not everything. You still have your story, your voice, your hands. And you're not alone." He paused, then pulled out a battered cardboard box from beneath his desk. Inside were scraps of glass, wire, and tools. Materials saved for students who couldn't afford their own. "I'll help you rebuild. You have until this afternoon. It won't be easy, but I know you can do it." The kindness nearly broke her. Linh nodded, wiping her face, and began to gather the scattered shards. With Mr. Wheeler's help, Linh worked through the morning, her fingers moving quickly, fueled by adrenaline and determination. They repurposed the largest pieces, fusing them together with wire. She changed her design, making the cracks part of the pattern, highlighting the breaks, letting the gold flow through the fractures like veins of light. She called her new piece Resilience. Other students, seeing her struggle, pitched in with spare glass, glue, and encouraging words. For the first time, Linh felt part of something bigger than her pain. As the noon deadline approached, Linh placed the finished sculpture on the display table. It was smaller than before, less polished, but more beautiful for its imperfections. Sunlight caught the golden seams, throwing fractured rainbows across the walls. The judges arrived, circulating among the entries. Linh watched from the edge of the room, heart thudding. When they paused before her piece, she heard one whisper, "Remarkable. There's a story here." When it was over, Linh collapsed onto a bench in the hallway, nerves spent. Mr. Wheeler sat beside her, pride in his voice. "No matter what happens, you did something extraordinary. You refused to break." Linh managed a shaky smile. "I didn't do it alone. Thank you, Mr. Wheeler, for believing in me." He squeezed her shoulder. "You believed first. The rest of us just followed your light." The results would be announced that evening. Linh rode home in a daze, her body exhausted, but her spirit somehow renewed. She didn't know if she would win, but she had reclaimed something much more important. Her dignity, her story, her power. As she entered the house, Mrs. Chang glared at her from the doorway. "You look a mess. I hope you didn't embarrass us today." Linh met her gaze, calm and clear. "No, Mrs. Chang. I think I made you proud, even if you'll never admit it." For once, her stepmother had no reply. That night, Linh waited for the results, heart thumping with anticipation and pride. She had survived the storm, and now the world would finally see her, cracks, scars, and all. That night, Linh paced her tiny corner of the laundry room, barely able to contain the storm inside her. The judge's announcement for the spring showcase would be posted online at 10 p.m. Every minute felt like an hour. But even as anticipation gnawed at her, Linh realized something had shifted. She was no longer waiting for validation. She already knew who she was and what she was capable of. The events of the last 24 hours had left their mark. The original sculpture was gone, but in its place stood something raw and honest, forged in fire and heartbreak. Her art was not about perfection. It was about resilience, the refusal to be erased. Linh spent the evening at the kitchen table, hands stained with flecks of gold, quietly sketching new ideas. Brandon hovered nearby, uncharacteristically quiet, his eyes darting between Lin and Mrs. Chang. Even Dr. Chang, usually buried in paperwork, seemed uneasy, casting furtive glances at his daughter. The air in the house had changed. There was a new tension, a sense that something was coming to a head. At 10:05 p.m., Lin sat alone on her cot, phone in hand, screen glowing. The list of winners was live. She scrolled, hardly daring to look, then froze. Best in show. Lin Chang, resilience. For a long moment, Lin just stared at the screen, hardly able to believe it. Then, tears spilled silently down her cheeks, not for what she'd lost, but for what she'd built with her own hands. It was more than a prize. It was proof. Mr. Wheeler's email arrived seconds later. You did it, Lin. Press from all over the state will want to talk to you. You'll have your piece exhibited at the State Museum next month. The scholarship is yours. So proud of you. Truly. Lin covered her mouth to muffle a sob. She wanted to share the moment with someone who would understand. But her grandmother was gone. Still, Lin imagined her sitting nearby, her warm hand on Lin's shoulder, whispering, "You are seen." As the news spread, Lin's classmates began sending messages. Congratulations from people who'd never spoken to her before. Even Melanie, the popular girl from art class, texted, "You're amazing. That piece was magic. Proud of you, Lin." But not everyone was celebrating. Downstairs, Mrs. Chang's voice rose in a shrill, barely controlled rage. "This is a nightmare. The news is already calling. They'll want interviews, pictures in our house. She'll ruin everything." Brandon lingered at the doorway, guilt clouding his features. When Lin passed him in the hall, he spoke quietly, not meeting her eyes. "I'm sorry," he muttered. "I shouldn't have. I wish I could take it back." Lin stopped, letting his words hang in the air. "It's not me you need to apologize to," she replied softly. "It's yourself. You let her make you into someone you're not." He swallowed hard, nodding once before slinking away. But Lin was done with apologies. The following morning, she was called to the principal's office. She arrived to find the art department head, Mr. Wheeler, and a woman in a tailored suit, Ms. Rivera, the lawyer. The principal cleared her throat. "Lin, your piece will be shown statewide, and the press wants an interview. The scholarship committee will meet you next week. Miss Rivera says there are some family matters to discuss as well." Lin glanced at Miss Rivera, who nodded encouragingly. "I filed an inquiry into your grandmother's will," she said quietly. "With the publicity from your win, it will be much harder for your stepmother to keep hiding the truth. This is your chance to tell your story, Lin, on your terms." Suddenly, the power shifted. For so long, Lin's voice had been dismissed, drowned out by the lies and control of others. Now, she had an audience, one that would listen. That afternoon, the local news arrived for an interview. The reporter asked about Lin's art, her inspiration, her home life. Lin answered honestly, careful not to smear her family, but refusing to hide her truth. "My grandmother taught me that glass can be fragile or strong. It depends on how it's made. This piece is about surviving, about finding strength in the places where you were broken." The next morning, the story was everywhere. Pictures of Lin's sculpture appeared on local TV, in the paper, and on social media. Formerly invisible, Lin's face was now the symbol of perseverance, a young woman who had turned pain into beauty. With attention came pressure. Mrs. Chang tried to restrict Lin's interviews, making frantic phone calls to block reporters. But the story was out. Dr. Chang, looking defeated, tried to reason with his wife, but Lin heard the bitterness in his voice. The cracks in the family facade were spreading. The scholarship committee called. Lin was invited to the State Museum's gala, where her piece would be unveiled to an audience of artists, collectors, and press. Miss Rivera pressed her advantage, filing a legal petition to unseal the original will. "They can't hide from this anymore," she told Lin. "The world is watching. The court will have to act." For the first time, Lin saw her stepmother afraid. For the first time, her father looked at her. Not through her, but at her. As if seeing her for the first time. The days passed in a blur of interviews, phone calls, and congratulations. Lin felt herself growing stronger, more certain. She wore her grandmother's locket to every event, a quiet signal of who she was and where she came from. At the gala, Lin stood before her sculpture, accepting applause from strangers. She looked out over the sea of faces and thought, this is what revenge looks like. Not anger or hatred, but being seen. Being undeniable. As the spotlight shone on her, Lin caught her own reflection in the polished glass. A young woman standing tall, unbreakable, beautiful in her own right. She had turned their cruelty into art, and the world had answered with admiration. But Lin knew her fight wasn't over. The hardest part was yet to come. It was time for the truth to surface. Not just in glass, but in the law, in the open, in front of everyone. For now, though, she allowed herself one moment of quiet triumph. This was the art of revenge, crafted not from hate, but from the courage to shine. The State Museum's grand rotunda buzzed with anticipation. Beneath the glass dome, surrounded by marble columns and glimmering spotlights, Lin stood beside her sculpture. Resilience, ready to face the world in a way she never could have imagined. Her hands were steady now, no longer the hands of an invisible girl, but of an artist whose voice had finally broken through the silence. The gala was packed. Patrons in designer gowns and sharp suits, local press, renowned artists, and art teachers from all over the state. Lin's piece stood at the center of it all, catching the afternoon light and throwing wild, colorful patterns across the floor. Guests paused, mesmerized, some whispering about the incredible story behind the work, others asking about the artist's family. Mr. Wheeler and Ms. Rivera hovered nearby, offering support and encouragement. Lin's classmates arrived too, beaming with pride. Even Melanie made her way through the crowd, giving Lin a quick hug and whispering, "You did it. You really did it." Lin smiled, but her nerves prickled beneath the surface. She knew this night was about more than art. It was a reckoning, a confrontation with everything her family had tried to hide. The museum's director took the podium and began the ceremony. "Tonight, we honor a young woman whose vision and courage have inspired us all. Lin Chang's resilience is more than a work of art. It is a testament to the strength that comes from surviving adversity and finding beauty in the cracks." Applause rippled through the rotunda. Lin stepped forward, blinking under the spotlight. For a moment, she saw herself at age 5, clutching marbles in her grandmother's sunroom, dreaming of color and light. She cleared her throat and spoke, her voice clear and unwavering. "My grandmother taught me that every broken piece can find its place again. She believed that art could heal. This piece is for anyone who has ever felt invisible or unwanted, anyone told that they don't belong. You do. The cracks are proof you survived." Her words hung in the air, settling like gentle rain. There was a hush, and then another wave of applause. Louder, more heartfelt, Reporters surged forward with cameras and microphones. Lynn, can you tell us more about your family's story? Where did your inspiration come from? Lynn answered honestly, never naming names, but refusing to hide. I come from a family that believes in keeping up appearances. Sometimes that means burying the truth. But my grandmother left me a legacy of courage, and tonight, I want to honor that. Back in the crowd, Lynn caught sight of her father and Mrs. Chang, who had slipped in unnoticed, and now hovered near the exit, clearly uncomfortable. Mrs. Chang's jaw was set, her eyes darting, but Dr. Chang's face was ashen and drawn. Brandon stood awkwardly beside them, not meeting anyone's gaze. Suddenly, Miss Rivera stepped forward, voice strong enough for all to hear. As Lynn's legal advocate, I would also like to announce that a petition has been filed to unseal the late Mrs. Chang's will. The courts have agreed to a formal review, due to recent evidence of possible suppression and fraud. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The museum director leaned in, intrigued. This is an unexpected development, he said, half to the audience, half to the family now caught in the spotlight. Mrs. Chang bristled, her mask cracking for the first time. This is not the place. But Lynn met her eyes, refusing to look away. This is exactly the place. My grandmother's legacy belongs here, in the light, not locked away. The local news captured every word, every tremor of emotion. The next morning, headlines blared. Glassdaughter's triumph. Teen artist's family secrets shake New Jersey's elite. Chang inheritance scandal. Will dispute follows art show sensation. Suddenly, Lynn's story was everywhere. The calls came pouring in. Lawyers, journalists, art foundations, even distant relatives Lynn had never met. The court date for the will's review was set for the following week. At home, Mrs. Chang stormed through the house, phone glued to her ear, barking orders to family lawyers. Dr. Chang stayed in his study, avoiding Lynn's gaze. Only Brandon tried haltingly to speak to her, offering quiet apologies and awkward attempts at conversation. Lynn, tired of the lies, kept her focus on the fight ahead. At school, Lynn was no longer invisible. Teachers stopped her in the hallways to offer congratulations. Younger students asked for her autograph. Even kids who'd ignored or teased her before now wanted to be near her, hoping some of her newfound light might rub off. But Lynn stayed grounded. She spent her free time with Mr. Wheeler, who helped her prepare for her speech at the upcoming scholarship ceremony, and with Miss Rivera, who explained what to expect at the hearing. The day before the court date, Lynn returned to the sunroom, the place where it had all begun. She opened her grandmother's letters, rereading each one. The sun filtered through colored glass, casting gentle rainbows across the faded rug. She closed her eyes and whispered, "I'm ready now." The next morning, the Chang family arrived at the courthouse under the glare of TV cameras. Mrs. Chang and Dr. Chang tried to keep their composure, but the truth was closing in. Lynn walked beside Miss Rivera, holding her head high, her grandmother's locket shining against her chest. As she entered the courtroom, Lynn realized she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every girl who had ever been silenced, for every glass daughter locked behind closed doors. The unveiling was complete. What came next would decide everything. The courthouse steps buzzed with media and onlookers, everyone angling for a glimpse of the Chang family saga. Lynn took a steadying breath, feeling the weight of 100 eyes, but also the invisible support of everyone who believed in her. Her grandmother, Mr. Wheeler, Miss Rivera, even the kids at school who'd seen her struggle and rise. Inside, the courtroom was cold and bright. Mrs. Chang sat rigidly beside Dr. Chang, their legal team bristling with folders and whispered strategies. Brandon sat behind them, hands folded in his lap, eyes downcast. Across the aisle, Lynn sat with Miss Rivera, holding her grandmother's locket for courage. The judge, a silver-haired woman with a direct gaze, called the room to order. "We are here to review the probate of the late Mrs. Huang Chang's will and consider evidence of suppression and fraud." The lawyers presented their cases. Ms. Rivera laid out every careful detail. The letters and documents Lynn had found, the hidden envelope with Lynn's name, photos of the sunroom, of the glass collection, and of the torn fragment of the will. The timeline showing when the original will vanished. Right after Lynn's grandmother's death, when Mrs. Chang had taken charge of the household. Mrs. Chang's lawyer argued that the most recent will left everything to the family as a whole. But Miss Rivera presented expert testimony. The signature on the new will was forged. The paper and ink dated months after the grandmother's death. The judge's frown deepened with every revelation. Then the final blow. Testimony from Mr. Wheeler, who described the change in Lynn after her grandmother died, and recounted how Mrs. Chang had actively barred Lynn from art, inheritance, and even the sunroom. His words painted a vivid picture of emotional abuse and manipulation. Dr. Chang was called to the stand last. He looked smaller than Lynn had ever seen him, his eyes ringed with guilt, voice barely more than a whisper. "I was weak," he admitted. "I let my wife convince me that Lynn didn't need her grandmother's legacy, that it would be better for the family, for Brandon. But my mother, she wanted Lynn to have her inheritance, her glass, her future. I failed them both." The courtroom was silent. Even Mrs. Chang stared at him, as if seeing him for the first time. The judge turned to Lynn. "Do you have anything you'd like to say?" Lynn stood, heart pounding. "For years I believed I was less than everyone else in my own home. My stepmother did everything she could to erase me, to take what was left for me by the only person who truly loved me here. But I am not invisible. I am not weak. I am my grandmother's granddaughter. I am the artist she hoped I would become. I only want what was meant for me, not out of hate, but out of respect for her and for myself." Her words echoed in the marble chamber, clear and strong. For the first time, she saw Mrs. Chang falter, the lines of control cracking. Brandon looked up, eyes wet with shame. Dr. Chang bowed his head. The judge reviewed the evidence one last time, then issued her verdict. The original will was valid. Lynn was the rightful heir to her grandmother's collection, the sunroom, and her share of the family estate. Mrs. Chang was found guilty of willful suppression and attempted fraud. An investigation into criminal charges would proceed. Dr. Chang was formally reprimanded for his failure to protect his daughter's interests. A wave of emotion swept the courtroom. Relief, disbelief, and for Lynn, a bittersweet sense of vindication. Reporters pressed forward as Lynn and Ms. Rivera exited the courthouse. Cameras flashed, microphones pushed close. "Lynn, how does it feel to win? What will you do next? Do you forgive your family?" Lynn paused, drawing in a breath of fresh spring air. "I don't think forgiveness is the right word," she replied, her voice steady. "This was never about revenge, but about justice. I want to live in the light, not in bitterness, not in darkness. My family's choices are theirs to carry. I will carry my own story forward, on my own terms." As she walked down the steps, Lynn felt the burden begin to lift. Brandon caught up to her, eyes red. "I'm sorry, Lynn," he said quietly, For everything. I wish I'd stood up for you." Lin nodded. "It's not too late for you to be better. But you have to decide who you want to be, without her voice in your head." He nodded, tears slipping down his cheeks. For once, there was no anger left between them. Just a strange, fragile peace. At home, Mrs. Chang was escorted out by investigators, still protesting her innocence. Dr. Chang lingered at the door, shoulders hunched. Lin stood in the sunroom that evening, the colors of glass dancing on the walls, her grandmother's presence palpable. She wept, not for what she'd lost, but for the woman she'd become. Strong, seen, unbreakable. That night, Lin slept soundly, for the first time in years. Tomorrow, her new life would begin. But tonight, she allowed herself to simply exist, whole and free. The house felt different now, brighter, lighter, almost as if the very walls were exhaling after years of secrets. Mrs. Chang's sharp voice was gone, replaced by the gentle ticking of the old clock in the sunroom and the distant chirping of birds. Lin wandered through the halls, reacquainting herself with the home she'd been exiled from within her own life. She spent the first morning after the court victory in her grandmother's sunroom, opening the windows to let in fresh air and light. The glass sculptures glowed in the spring sun, casting dancing colors across the faded rug. Lin arranged them lovingly, whispering thanks to her grandmother for never giving up on her, even from beyond the grave. Over the next week, the community's response surprised her. Neighbors, who had once looked through her, as if she were invisible, stopped her on the street, offering congratulations and apologies. Teachers invited her to share her story with younger students. Kids from school, some of whom had once called her the maid, now smiled shyly, some even asking for art lessons. With Ms. Rivera's help, Lin completed the paperwork to officially inherit her share of the estate. The sunroom, her grandmother's art, and the modest trust fund would give her freedom she'd never known. She decided, without hesitation, to use a portion of her inheritance to open a small community art studio, right in the old sunroom. It would be a space for kids who needed a refuge, a place to shape glass, paint, or just belong. The day the studio opened, sunlight poured through the windows, filling the room with a warmth Lin hadn't felt since childhood. Melanie and her friends brought cookies. Mr. Wheeler donated supplies and hung a sign over the door. "The Glass Daughter Studio." The first students trickled in. A nervous girl with a stutter, a boy who'd been bullied for his accent, a quiet foster kid. Lin greeted each one with a smile and a promise. "Here, you're seen. Here, you matter." Brandon came by one afternoon, standing awkwardly in the doorway. He watched the children shape colorful glass beads, his face a mixture of guilt and wonder. I just wanted to say thank you," he said quietly, "for not giving up, for being braver than I ever was." Lin met his eyes, offering him a small piece of blue glass, the color of hope. "You can help, you know, if you want. It's never too late." He nodded, and for the first time they smiled at each other. Siblings not by fate, but by choice. As for Dr. Chang, he struggled to mend what he'd broken. He attended Lin's art events, offered quiet support, and wrote a letter to the local paper confessing his failures and expressing pride in his daughter's strength. It would take time, maybe forever, for true forgiveness. But Lin found peace in knowing she had stood her ground, had refused to be erased. The press attention faded, replaced by quieter joys. Laughter in the sunroom, the pride of new students discovering their own talents, The knowledge that her story had inspired others to speak up and claim their worth. On the anniversary of her grandmother's death, Linh stood alone in the sunroom, surrounded by prisms of light. She traced her fingers along the inscription on her final piece. "For every glass daughter who survived," she whispered. "I made it, Grandma. I'm free." And she was. Not because she had destroyed her enemies, but because she had transformed their cruelty into purpose. Her revenge was not loud or cruel. It was the quiet, enduring light that filled every corner of her world, and the worlds of those who came after. As the sun set, Linh sat in her grandmother's old armchair, watching the children work and laugh. The house, once a place of shadows, was now full of hope. Linh knew there would always be scars, but she also knew, with unwavering certainty, that she was more than their wounds. She was the glass daughter, resilient, radiant, unbreakable, and their light would never fade,